We support the organization, the self-organization, the class-independent organization of the working class to fight for its demands and not be co-opted by a party that limits those demands and wants to make a peaceful relationship with the bosses and with the state and with the, politicians, the regime. We want the working class to fight as its own actor.
Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. My name is Oden. Today we're talking about the 2024 US election. I'm joined by repeat podcast guest, my comrade Madeleine Freeman, who is also a writer and editor here at Left Voice. This is a really wide-ranging conversation because we had a lot to dig into. We discussed why Trump won, the crisis of neoliberalism, the Democrats' rightward shift, the labor movement, the Palestine movement, and more. We talked about the importance of not abandoning the fight for oppressed groups and the need to organize and unite the working class. So I'll keep this introduction short so that we can jump into that. But before we start, there is something I want to emphasize about the future and about the incoming Trump administration. And that is, what happens next depends on us. To quote my comrade Tatiana Cozzarelli in a very heartening piece that I'll link to in the show notes, our power is not in the polls, and our power is not in a Democratic Party that is committing genocide that deports and attacks the working class. It's in our self-organization as workers and students. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the fact that this election undeniably represented a rightward shift in US politics, and we'll get into why that is. But there's also some good news, or there are some auspicious elements, we could say, of the current political terrain that I want to emphasize. For example, in the past few years, the labor movement has been reawakening after years of a sort of hibernation following attacks from neoliberalism. Like this fall, we saw strikes at Boeing, and across the country, thousands of people are and have been forming new unions. We've seen an explosive student movement, like this past spring in particular, with students across the country organizing encampments for Palestine. And on the note of students, we've also seen university unions going on strike, including the UC's strike against repression of the Palestine movement, and dozens of other unions at schools striking for higher wages and better working conditions. What I want to say here is that if Trump is stronger in 2024 than he was in 2016, then it means we'll have to fight back stronger too. And there's great potential for this, as I just laid out, but as we'll also talk about in this podcast episode. And the power to do this is in the working class and social movements. If we can organize together from below, independently of the Democrats, we can unite our struggles, we can stop Trump in his tracks. And this unity can be the foundation for a working class party that fights for socialism, a foundation for a better world. Here's my conversation with Madeleine Freeman. Madeleine, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Oden, what's up?
What a year.
Yeah.
What a week. What a 2 weeks.
What a month. What
a month. Yeah. I mean, it feels super surreal to have this conversation because, like, before the election happened, I was feeling a little bit like, kind of like that cliche lady from the Titanic meme where she's like, it's been 84 years.
Yes.
But I'm now also feeling like it's been about 84 years since the election actually happened, even though, as we're recording this, just for context, it is, I think, almost exactly 2 weeks since the election.
Only
yeah, can you believe? Yeah, it is only 2 weeks. Yeah.
Wild. Okay.
So a lot has happened. I mean, by the time we finish recording this, who knows, there might have been more cabinet appointments. So just to, again, be clear with the listeners here, we will not be able to tackle every detail of the transition team and stuff like that. But with that being said, I do think it would be useful to kind of set the stage for the conversation with the main trends in the election, like not to go too far into the numbers and the stats, but like basically what we know so far. So Donald Trump has won, obviously, the Electoral College, and although I think they are still getting to the final tally of the popular vote, he appears to be the first Republican to win the popular vote since George W. Bush in 2004. He got more votes this election than he did in both 2016 and 2020, which I just want to point out shows an expansion in his base rather than necessarily low turnout for Harris or like literally just a rejection of Democrats. And kind of the biggest story here, which I think we'll kind of dig into through this conversation, is that he made really big gains among the working class. So, a particularly notable story that the mainstream media, I think, has actually been calling the diploma divide is that Donald Trump has made a lot of gains. Republicans have made a lot of gains among non college educated people. So people with college degrees are more likely these days to vote Democratic. And the other really striking trend in this election is that Trump also made big gains among other groups that traditionally lean Democratic. So he doubled his percentage points among Black voters compared to 2020. He won more Latino votes than any other Republican candidate in history. He won, I think, at the time of recording, about 46% of Latino voters. And there was only one group that Harris made significant gains with, which is voters who made or voters who make over $100,000 a year. And although we're focusing obviously more on the kind of presidency in this conversation, I should also note that Republicans have officially won a trifecta, so they have control over the presidency, both houses of Congress, and they have a 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court. Am I missing anything here? Anything you think I should add to these trends?
No, I think that sounds really correct, Odin. I mean, it's just really stark. If you look at the maps that some of like the big media outlets have put out, like Washington Post or New York Times, and they have all the arrows for like where, the shift to if those races shifted to the Republicans or to the Democrats, like it's a sea of red. I mean, between abstentions for the Democrats and then voters defecting to the Republican Party, I mean, that is the main through line of the election, right? Is that as all the liberal outlets have said, like the Democratic Party lost the working class, and not just the white working class, but a diverse coalition of the working class. And that's kind of, I think, what we're seeing emerging from the election is that Trump has successfully in this election secured a different type of coalition for his voter base than before, either in 2016 or 2020. And that's sort of what's most remarkable. And what remains to be seen is, like we'll get into in the podcast for sure and talk more about, is that, it's not clear whether this is a more permanent realignment of working class votes towards the Republican Party, or whether this is, very much the result of, well, we know that it's the result of the policies of the Democratic Party, but whether it represents a more permanent realignment of votes.
Totally, yeah. And just to clarify, just in terms of the terminology here, I mean, the mainstream media has been using these terms. So I think it's maybe not new for listeners, but there has been this overall story that you touched on of de-alignment or realignment, I think you mentioned. And just to clarify, it's this idea, from my understanding, that many workers, particularly low income sectors, precarious sectors, have moved away from the Democratic Party and toward the Republican Party. And obviously, that didn't start in 2024 or in 2020 or in 2016, but it's kind of part of a longer process of, yeah, voters moving, lower income voters in particular, moving away from the Democratic Party. And actually, I want to just dwell on this point for a sec because I think it's really crucial in terms of context, right? That the Democrats have lost the sort of working class consensus or support that they established in the 20th century. But we also have to be clear about how there's been what we've described as a shattering of the so called Obama coalition. So Barack Obama was able to solidify a Democratic Party coalition or like voting base that was very multiracial, very working class, that had a lot of union support, but then also coexisted in a very pro capitalist party. So, to put it kind of simply, or at least concisely, Obama tried to rally this diverse coalition around the Democrats' version of the neoliberal project for his 8-year presidency. Or to be a little bit more concrete and specific here, he channeled the aspirations of this multiracial working class coalition into enthusiasm for the party of Wall Street. And so I say this, or like I wanted to emphasize this, because what we see from these election results, like one of the really core things that these results really show is the breaking of this diverse Obama coalition. With that being said, let's talk a little bit about why Trump won. And I mean, obviously, this is a huge question that doesn't just have one answer. We're still kind of digesting this, but I do think that there are a few things that we can point to. And I think a good starting point would be this discussion of what we've called the crisis of neoliberalism. What I think also the mainstream media has kind of touched on as being a rejection of the current order, of people voting for Donald Trump as a sort of change candidate. Can you talk a little bit more about what we mean by this?
Yeah, for sure. And oddly enough, I think it's something, maybe we can expect this to be missing from sort of the mainstream media outlets' narrative of what happened with the election. But I even see, in particular, like publications like, Jacobin or other left outlets sort of missing this point that, the 2024 election is happening just as in 2016 and 2020 in the middle of a historic crisis of the neoliberal world order, which has structured the political regime, economic terrain, geopolitical terrain in the United States for decades, right? And what we've seen over the last couple of decades and particularly accelerated in the last several years is a questioning of that regime. So we call, there's the structural crisis of neoliberalism, which has its roots in economic shifts, which has its roots in also social and political effects. But also, what we have said in Left Voice in our analysis is that one expression of this crisis of neoliberalism is this idea of organic crisis. Basically, what this means is, that we use the phrase often like the crisis between the representatives and the represented. So, in the elections, that becomes very clear. The people voting and the people they're voting for, whether it's the president, the Senate, the House of Representatives, but it extends beyond that to the traditional sort of figures who guide politics in the US. But also part of this organic crisis is the questioning, and what gets at the root of it is a questioning of whether the ruling class and its representatives actually have the ability to lead a nation, right? And it's basically a crisis in the authority of the state. And this is important not to like get too theoretical, because this is the process that we've seen unfolding in the US for the last 10 to 15 years, if not more, right?
Yeah, just to clarify real quick what we mean here in terms of a sort of timeline is we're not trying to say that the crisis began in 2008. The crises that we're talking about, the crises of neoliberalism, they have their roots and stretch back further than this. And that's definitely beyond the scope of this particular podcast episode. But 2008 is really when this crisis reaches a boiling point.
Yes, exactly. And we see that sort of also where it becomes most acute, the changes that, for, lack of not lack of a better word, the attacks against the working class sort of reach a pitch in how they're expressed, right? We see those come out more clearly, and that was embodied, as you say, in the crisis of 2008, and reflected a lot of what had changed for working people in the United States. And so we've sort of seen with, ebbs and flows, that process sort of unfolding since then. That was very much what was at stake in this election. Not to repeat ourselves, but basically you had one party with the Democratic Party who, for all intents and purposes, basically backed the status quo, right? And I think Harris's campaign very much embodied this, though it doesn't just start with Harris's campaign, which we'll get back to as well. But like, rather than recognize, as we've seen in 2016, which paved the way for the emergence of people like Sanders and Trump, who embodied sort of challenges to the traditional like neoliberal functioning of the economy, politics, etc. in the United States. The Democrats in this election doubled down on defending the neoliberal status quo, even if their policies weren't, like forward facing, like, austerity policies, gut everything, free regulation of the market, even if they weren't leading with those things, they're defending a status quo where those things are baked in. They weren't posing anything new or that would remarkably change people's lives. And then on the other hand, you have the Republican Party, which also is a party of capital. Let's be clear, also are proposing elements that prop up the neoliberal regime, but with a figure like Trump, who, particularly in the wake of January 6th, has been able to cement, his domination of the Republican Party, posing himself as sort of a change, a rupture, completely against that status quo. And so I think, what we can say about the election is that it's not just a rejection of Harris or the Democrats in this moment, but also a rejection of the neoliberal order, of the status quo. And that has everything to do with why allegiances are shifting somewhat to Trump and the results that we saw.
Totally, yeah. And I think that this is a part of the mainstream media's analysis that we do really agree with. And there's been a lot of soul searching among Democrats in terms of, they really staked out their position in terms of like, defending democracy, defending, US institutions and stuff like that. But I think we have to be realistic about the fact that that rings very hollow to US voters who've lost faith in US democracy, who've lost faith in US institutions. And to be, I mean, even more concrete, I mean, thinking about things like the exploding costs of living, the fact that like it is extremely expensive to live in the United States. We've had huge issues with inflation in terms of food prices and stuff like that, all while people are seeing that the US has seemingly unlimited money to send to the overseas war machine, pretty much.
Exactly. And that's super important because for two reasons. On the one hand, right, like there's this, it's pretty incredible to read like the New York Times and right now because it's just this, and not just the media outlets, but pundits and analysts who are, putting stuff out on Twitter and stuff, like they're just really leaning into blaming the working class. Like, oh, what are we gonna do? Like they're just hopelessly right wing. They know who Trump was and they still voted for him. And look what Biden did. Biden took down inflation. Unemployment was low. They're just mad that the tax on their goods was so high and that was necessary. The economy bounced back after the pandemic. Look, like this is misinformation, blah, 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 blah.
It sounds to me like fundamentally the problem was that workers did not have the opportunity to see enough charts of lines going up. And I think
Yes,
that that would have really solidified things for the Democrats.
totally.
Yes.
And the fact is that for exactly, because the problems are more structural and long standing, and Biden's regime, for all of the, negotiated promises and certain policies that he put forward in the beginning of his administration, it didn't meaningfully impact the underlying hardship that working class people feel in the US. Exactly on what you're saying. Like, people are mad about utilities, rent, the price of food. And like that's what you see emerge from people who are, for example, splitting their ticket between figures like AOC and Trump. They want to see market differences in their and need to see market differences in their living conditions and the daily price of goods. And Trump positioned himself as the person who said, look what that administration did. Like, you lived better under me, put me back in office. And so I think that exactly that it's the Democrats ultimately defend a system where people were already hurting and it only was exacerbated and didn't mark a meaningful change from that. And in fact, like, Harris didn't embrace the policies of the Biden administration despite not wanting to, put too much distance or differentiate herself. And she said, like, I wouldn't change a thing, right? Like, she did, create a more moderate, quote unquote, campaign, a more right wing campaign that sort of shifted away from even the tepid populist promises that Biden offered in his 2020 campaign, which of course, like, those promises didn't happen over the course of the administration, but nevertheless, like,
Yeah, totally. And like to be clear, obviously our focus here isn't on providing a full balance sheet of the Biden presidency, but I do think it's worth pausing here when we talk about like the failure of the status quo to really mention that Biden's presidency was absolutely littered with broken progressive promises. Like promises for a public healthcare option, increases to the minimum wage, parental leave, free community college, and things like that just absolutely never materialized during his presidency.
And I think that that's really important. Also to touch on is that, because like you said, like there's infinite money to go to wars overseas, there's infinite money for the defense budget, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. People are pissed about the war in Ukraine for, you know various reasons, from opposing genocide to opposing the cost of the relationship with Israel. People are opposed to the U.S. support for Israel and its genocide against Gaza. But part of that even is a reflection of exactly the shifts that are happening in the regime as a result of the crisis of neoliberalism, right? Like, in some sense, the Democratic Party, yeah, like in this moment, it sees its only choice as being able to go to the right to create better conditions to try to get out of the structural and social limitations that are produced by this crisis. And I think that's really important, right? That it's not just that they, in this one election, are like, we want white women in the suburbs. Like, that's who we are targeting, and they're going to win us the election, which, by the way, didn't happen, right? Not just the winning, but it seems that Trump also made gains amongst women, but rather to say that, this is part of how they're betting the next several years are going to play out in terms of a larger crisis, because that's even reflected in the way that the bourgeoisie, like the big capitalists, whether it's finance capital or energy sectors, are sort of taking, they're taking their bets. And a lot of them, still the majority, went for Harris, right? There were market differences in this election, and the businesses and capitalists and the richest people in the world going for Trump, like Elon Musk and others in the tech industry. But still, the Democratic Party, the big capitalists, bet on them to be able to protect their interests, precisely because they defend, all in all, with some shifts here and there, the neoliberal status quo.
Yeah, and that really speaks to the fundamental character of the Democratic Party as well. And, I think we'll get into this a little bit more in depth soon in this conversation, but I mean, this idea that, like, this is a party that rules fundamentally for the status quo, for big capital.
Right. Like, we, of course, because I think so much of the left finds itself sort of making a deal with the devil in the Democratic Party, like, yeah, there's a lot of analysis, and it's crucial because the fight for socialism passes through breaking that relationship with the Democratic Party, as we've said like many times before on Left Voice or in the podcast. But like, at the same time, yeah, like we have to be clear eyed about the fact that another Trump administration is going to mean attacks on the working class and most vulnerable communities. Like, that's coming. And it's, that's why sort of the finger waving at, like, how could, people vote for, whoever, like, this overemphasis on who people voted for on election day makes no sense. Like, it makes sense, the fear that people have for the Trump administration. But what we do know, like so far, is that, yeah, I mean, it's evidence in the fact that Elon Musk is Trump's best friend, right? This is a union buster, someone who is on the cutting edge of, eating away at the rights of workers, of making them into human
Totally.
beings, of cutting wages, cutting the cost of labor to the bone, right? And yet the Republican Party has tried to paint itself as, not the party of right to work, but the party that can be a home for labor, can be a home for the working class, for the organized working class. And, that was, of course, in no small part shaped by the fact that Sean O'Brien spoke at the RNC, Sean O'Brien, the president of Teamsters, right? They didn't put forward an official endorsement, but speaking at the RNC was a was a big sign, right? And so, yeah, there's plenty of workers, both organized workers, but particularly precarious workers who've slipped the exact targets of neoliberalism, who of neoliberal policies, who've seen their living conditions degraded, their work made more precarious and uncertain, who see in Trump an alternative. And I think that that's kind of the point that we have to drive home, and how we think about what's next is that, you know, the fight against these attacks, and they're coming, involves uniting the ranks of the working class, when actually, like, whether it's the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, they're trying to divide the working class, whether it's around immigrants and people who are, I don't know, born in the United States, or workers who are contract or full-time and organized, whether it's workers who, like if you even just take somewhere like UPS, which is on the forefront of tiered labor, like workers who have differences in terms of what they're paid and the benefits they have based on, their positions. So I think that, all of the conversations that we have going forward in terms of, the best way to, yeah, start thinking about how to organize under a second Trump administration to face these attacks means passes through the question of uniting the working class.
Totally, yeah. I mean, I think this gets to what I guess I would call kind of like another prong of what I've noticed in the mainstream analysis. So, what we've kind of implied kind of across the conversation so far is that like we do agree with some parts of the mainstream media's analysis of like the working conditions decline in living conditions for the working class and kind of the shortcomings, to put it very mildly, of neoliberalism. But there's kind of this other angle that the mainstream media is also putting forward, which is the rightward shift of the electorate. And there's this idea that, people are putting forward from, like, for example, the Pod Save America guys and other sort of mainstream pundits, that, the US electorate is simply moving to the right on immigration. The US electorate does not want, trans people in sports and in bathrooms, etc. That the Democrats basically have moved way too far to the left on these policies. What do we say to that idea? Like, do we agree that there's been a right-wing shift in the electorate?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, what we do know is that a majority of people in the United States, and as we've been saying throughout the conversation, many of them members of the working class, voted for a candidate whose the pillars of that campaign were, anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-trans sentiment, stands for a program that is completely against the rights of women, right? Like, that's a conversation for another day. But yeah, the tenets of Project 2025 are in the background there, and with the cabinet picks much less so in the background. But, and people voted for that candidate. And I think there is an element that we can say that people voted in spite of those things, or under the logic that, well, Trump can only go so far. I may not want those things, but I do want to be able to pay my rent. I do want to be able to, not be living paycheck to paycheck. And so we can see then, objectively, yes, the electorate has shifted to the right. We even see more support, or rather less support, for example, for increased immigration. And we see, particularly on that question. However, for me, I think that, like, on the other hand, this is something that's been fabricated by the Democratic Party more than anything else, which is to say that, who are the ones saying that, who are moderating their positions, taking more right wing stances on the question of trans rights and immigration? And it's the Democratic Party. Like, they made the assumption that the electorate wanted these things, that this was going to be what made them more attractive to voters and force voters to make that choice, right? Rather than put forward policies that the working class could get behind, and behind a program of defending the democratic rights of the most vulnerable and oppressed, right? So, to me, yes, there's definitely evidence that folks have shifted to the right on these issues, but on a whole host of other issues, people remain very progressive, right? And are thirsting for change, whether it's on the question of universal health care, whether it's on the question of, as we saw in the propositions and ballot measures, like the question of raising the minimum wage in states, on the question of abortion rights. I mean, that deserves, pausing there for a second on its own. Even in deeply red states, uh, where abortion was on the ballot, it won. I mean, the measure didn't pass in Florida because they need a wildly high supermajority to pass, but the majority of people, over 50%, supported abortion. In deeply red Trump states, people who voted for Trump voted for abortion. In most of those places, abortion was more popular than Harris. And so, of course, like, we see people who understand that, it's not that they have this incredible allegiance to the free market and to capitalism, though some do, but are looking for material changes in their lives. And to say that, this is the result of a working class that's increasingly racist and sexist, well, I don't know. People have been saying since 2016 that, they thought that Trump would be better for the economy. And to me, this is more evidence of disillusionment with the Democratic Party and its sort of hollow representation politics than it is, an active distaste for the rights of minorities and oppressed people, right?
Yeah, something else I think is worth pausing on is something that you mentioned about the Democrats shifting toward the right. I mean, something that's really funny in like an infuriating way is the extent to which people are talking about how, Democrats went too far left. Like give me a break. I mean, the Democrats they spent more time with freaking the Cheneys, with Liz
Yep.
Cheney on the campaign trail than with someone like Sean Fain, for example. Like if I'm just going to throw out, a more progressive figure out there, like in terms of immigration, also we saw that like throughout the campaign, not just Biden but also Kamala Harris were trying to tack to Trump's right on immigration, and I mean they didn't go as far as to talk about how like men shouldn't be in women's sports or whatever. But I mean, there was that interview with Kamala Harris where they were asking her, I think, about like, don't quote me on exactly where the place was, but I think it was something about like laws against gender affirming care for young people in Georgia or something like that. And the interviewer asked Kamala Harris like, "What do you think about this?" Basically, and she said, "I think we should follow the law." So this whole idea that the Democrats were just like too lefty is like a huge absolute like insulting joke. And so I wanted to ask you, can you speak a little bit to the ways in which, actually the Democrats played a role in strengthening the right, especially in this election?
Yeah, and Oden and I wrote an article, which I'm sure we'll link in the notes here, with this very title that the Democrats paved the way, rightward shift paved the way for Trump. But yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Like, if you think about 2020, I mean, the Democrats were kneeling in their kente cloth. They were, there was the George Floyd Policing Act. I mean, horrible to even put those two things together, but you know what I mean. Like they had to make concessions, not even make concessions, had to pay lip service to the millions of people who are out in the streets protesting against racism, and it played a role in the type of legislation that they were putting forward, even if they ultimately proved hollow and fruitless during the administration. But yeah, I mean, in this campaign, that was all abandoned. Harris herself, like Harris didn't talk about, didn't speak to the real issues of structural racism at all. Even on the question of women's rights, it was all of the worst case scenarios that women and like yeah, that people like get abortions for. Those were touted as the exact reason they need to protect abortion. And yes, of course, but they became not the party of choice, but this sort of as a last resort type of thing. So anyway, all that to say, like even moderating on issues that they thought that they could win didn't prove to help Democrats at all. And it's even just amazing to see, people propping up Trump as the peace candidate, right? Like this is wild to me that, people are saying that Trump is going to get us out of Ukraine, is going to get us out of the Middle East. Like that's the candidate that's going to free up that money to put in our pockets. And of course we'll see, just look at his cabinet, like there are war hawks aplenty there. Even with this sort of protectionist spin, or this isolationist spin that MAGA has. But all that to say, parading Liz Cheney, who is not a defender of peace by any means, who upholds the legacy of her father, didn't resonate with people at all. This isn't just about Harris's campaign. Like, we also saw parts of that rightward shift under the Biden administration. And that's really important because there are a lot of outlets that kind of hold up Biden as the promise that the Democrats made that never materialized, right? This is what the Democratic Party could be: the most progressive, most pro labor, most progressive since FDR, and best for working people administration that could be. And yet it was Biden who acted as a check on class struggle. Remember, with the railroad workers strike, they negotiated that deal. The Biden administration has been instrumental in even, putting its finger on the scales of the biggest, most consequential labor struggles, and even in the last year. And I think that's really important, right? Is that, this rightward shift is not just, and we keep saying it, but it's not just about Harris and the opportunity economy, or Harris and the question of abortion and trans rights and all of that, which the seeds were sown for that under the Biden administration and before as well. And then the fact that they did a whole maneuver to get Sanders out of the political terrain, right? And of course, like, we're not trying to say that Sanders would have represented a complete break, but it would have been a different flavor of reformism within the structure of capitalism, right? And so not only that, not just it's not just a matter of the policies at the highest level of government, but we also saw how at key figures of the progressive movement, who are supposed to be the ones pushing Biden left, also have followed the Democratic Party and supported and given left cover in some sense to every step to the right that both Biden and Harris have taken. And you mentioned Sean Fain earlier, the president of the UAW, who represents, in some sense, a labor movement that we haven't seen in the US in a very long time. He does represent a different tactic of unionism than just the straight up business unionism that was the result of neoliberalism in the United States and its effect on the labor movement. But we saw Sean Fain, getting up at the DNC alongside AOC, alongside Republicans, former Republicans, current Republicans, police officers, and saying that Harris was going to be the champion of the working class, when not a single policy that she put forward, beyond where she tailed the Biden administration, right? She didn't advertise the fact that she was the PRO Act, so to speak, right? Like, she didn't advertise those aspects of her campaign, and he stood there and said that she would fight for working people. And AOC, the same thing, right? Like, providing, in the most cynical way, cover for the leading role that the Biden administration has played in the genocide of Gazans, right? Like, of Palestinians, of countless Palestinians. So what we can see here, is that the progressive wing that was supposed to be this opposition to Harris, or not even opposition, but a friendly challenge, right? Also helped.
Pushing them left, allegedly.
Yes, exactly. Pushing them left. Even Sanders, and I'll get back to that in a second, actually just lowered the bar for lesser evilism time and time again. And to the point that it was just, if you want abortion, support one of the pioneers of the genocide in Gaza. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Pitting the rights of the oppressed abroad against the rights of people here. And that's a terrible bargain to ask people to make. And I don't think it's the one that working class people want in the United States, right? And they just lowered the bar and lowered the bar. And to a certain extent, we're seeing in the results of the election that, that lesser evilism was less palatable, I think.
Yeah, and I think, just to go back to what you mentioned about, Sean Fain, especially, and these union bureaucrats, standing on the stage with Joe Biden, like throwing their full-throated, full-hearted support behind Joe Biden. It's not just that we're saying, like, oh, this is like a bad look or whatever. It's more saying, that, like, in the analysis of de-alignment, in the analysis of why the election went the particular way that it did, this is exactly the kind of thing that opens the space for the Republican Party to paint itself as a pro-labor party. So the fact that, workers overwhelmingly, or many people without a college diploma, many people working in precarious, like low-paid jobs, the fact that they went for Trump in such huge numbers is not some, coincidence. It's not that they're like, unintelligent or whatever, but it's like they see these kinds of things. They see, what the Democrats are doing, what their leaders are doing in the labor movement. And that is precisely what opens up the field for the Republicans to get the support from these sectors.
Yeah, exactly. And to paint themselves as a change, as a rupture. with the Democrats, for sure.
I think something that's a little bit complicated is thinking about the role of the Palestine movement in this election and the role that the genocide in Gaza played. Because I don't know that we'd go as far as to say, or actually, I'm pretty sure we would not go as far as to say that like Biden's stance on Palestine, lost him the election, or Harris's complicity in the genocide lost her the election. But at the same time, it is true that it is a reason why there were many people who stayed home, particularly in places like Michigan. Can you talk a little bit about the role that the Palestine movement and this genocide played in the election and in the outcome?
Yeah, this is super important. I mean, as you said, I think like it was decisive in places like Michigan, for example, but definitely we saw the effects of that throughout the country, and the effects of a public opinion on the genocide in Gaza. And to take a step back for a second, we have to talk about what the Palestine movement truly represents as a sort of like a huge change in US society, right? Which is to say that hundreds of thousands, millions of young people, but not just, right? Like a multi-generational group of people here are breaking with the logic of that's entrenched in US society of the relationship between the US and Israel and US Zionism. And that was something that has been unquestioned for decades in the United States. That this was an untouchable relationship politically and socially in the United States. And as people were watching this genocide unfold on their cell phones and seeing that it was United U.S. bombs, U.S. weapons that were responsible for the absolute destruction of Gaza and not just, and now as we're seeing even in Lebanon and in other parts of Palestine, like people were wondering why and who is that helping? And people are saying, why is all of our money going to this when we can't make ends meet here? And not just that, it's not just the utilitarian, like, oh, there's money going there but not money for us, which of course is a big part of it, but also seeing that that is not what people in the US can support, and definitely not making the bargain that our rights here mean suppressing the rights of people abroad. And so that rupture in the Zionist consensus, so to speak, and particularly that started with a sector of young Jewish people in the United States who broke with Zionism, broke family connections over that debate. Like that was a huge change in US society, and not just ideologically, though that's a huge part of it, but it questions the very heart of US imperialism. And as we've explained elsewhere in Left Voice, at the heart of US imperialism, at the heart of what has led the United States to become a global hegemon, has in fact been the relationship that it has with Israel, the close relationship that it has with the state of Israel. And so that's also being called into question, right? And that also calls into question the nature of the United States as this global hegemon, right? And so it's a wider questioning of US imperialism. And it's precisely because of that that the Democratic Party couldn't fully do what they did with BLM and co opt the movement back into its wing, because the Democratic Party is essentially a capitalist, imperialist, and therefore Zionist party. We saw Biden say, I am a proud Zionist, right? And of course, like Harris continued that. I mean, someone in her campaign said, all right, throw him a bone and at least talk about the self-determination and rights of Palestinian people, and using the correct methods to do ethnic cleansing there. But preceding that always is this idea of Israel's right to defend itself, right? That comes first and foremost, and protecting the relationship between the United States and Israel. And so the Democratic Party couldn't fully try to usher those people back into the fold, usher the millions of people back into the Democratic Party to make the bargain to vote for Harris. And maybe plenty of people did, but plenty of people stayed home. And plenty of people voted for Trump on this issue, or voted third party. More so than anything, on this question, I think was abstentionism. And I don't want to make assumptions, but especially in a place like New York, where you see, for example, like, of course, Harris won New York, but she won by many less votes and Trump gained votes. But the people who didn't vote for Harris, a lot of them, I'm sure, was in part on this question. And there's a sense in which I think the dissatisfaction, well, you know what I'm saying?
Dissatisfaction. There
Dissatisfaction.
we
Oh my God.
go.
When you're on the podcast,
Yeah,
people,
it's embarrassing. Shame. Shame.
oh man. In a sense, the Palestine movement represents the larger dissatisfaction that a younger generation, a new political generation, because it's not just about age, like has had with its experience with the Democratic Party, right? And so I think that, it's becoming increasingly harder for that political generation to get behind the lesser evilism argument and to say hold your nose to protect democratic rights, because that didn't happen under the Biden administration, right? Like, it is about Palestine, but it's also about the fact that a Biden administration didn't protect our right to an abortion. It didn't protect voting rights or anything else that was supposed to justify voting for.
Famously, things were overturned precisely during the Biden administration. I mean, people seem to forget that Roe v. Wade was overturned under Biden's watch.
Exactly. And when the Democrats had the majority in both houses, right? And in fact, they demobilized people. And to return to Palestine, I mean, the Democratic Party has been on the forefront in some sense in the way that they've demonized protesters. Maybe not, alongside the Republicans, let's be real, like it's bipartisan. Trump is as much as a Zionist and, much closer of an ally to Netanyahu than even the Democratic Party, although, but the Democratic Party, alongside the Republicans, advocated for the repression of the Palestine movement, calling every protester anti Semitic for protesting a genocide, and made and paved the way for what, I think we can argue convincingly makes it harder to organize in the future, right? Anti-protester laws, like seeing what's happening in the universities, which of course, are not, it's not Democratic Party politicians who are, in the halls of Columbia, Yale, whatever, but it is true that, in some sense, like they pull the, I don't want to say pull the strings, that's too conspiratorial, but have that political influence, and for sure put pressure on those administrators to clamp down on protests, and in part, in an effort to protect the role that universities play in funding Israel and taking funding, this reciprocal relationship. In order to defend that relationship, they made these new laws that also hamper our ability to protest in general, and not just on Palestine, but broader than that. And so I think that, it was a much harder case to make for a lot of people to hold their noses for Harris, is essentially what it boils down to.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to shift a little bit and get into this question of what we need to do going forward, and some of the ways that we differ from the perspectives taken by, certainly by progressive groups, but also, reformist leftist groups and others. So we talked about the Democrats' rightward shift and how there are a lot of Democratic strategists, Democratic pundits who are basically saying, Democrats need to turn to the left. They need to throw more oppressed people under the bus. They need to stop using the word Latinx, even though, like, I have not heard a single Democrat use that word in years, but whatever. But this kind of idea of turning right isn't totally unique to Democrats. And I feel like we're seeing something kind of similar among some sectors who are kind of emphasizing that we need to start, or rather, the Democrats, I should say, but also maybe leftists generally, need to focus more on economic populism. So there have been some articles, for example, in Jacobin magazine, an editorial also by Bhaskar Sunkara in The Guardian, Bhaskar Sunkara, the founder of Jacobin magazine, who are emphasizing basically that the left, as well as the Democrats, need to return to sort of bread and butter issues. They need to return to these issues like, a higher minimum wage, rent control, higher taxes on billionaires, and stuff like that. These sorts of issues, rather than focusing on what they would call sort of identity related issues. What do we think about this? Or to put it in maybe like a slightly sassy way, why is it important not to throw oppressed people under the bus? Why do we not support the strategy of throwing everything out except focusing on bread and butter economic populist issues?
Yeah. When you phrase it like that, it seems pretty self-evident,
Yeah.
right? But the argument goes basically that, like, as you said, like, we saw from this election that it was the economy, stupid, right? That people, like, are suffering under the current conditions of the economy. And if the Democrats had wanted to win, they would have embraced the policies of someone like Sanders: universal health care, a universal child care. The question of economic populism, yeah, it's a good one. So the story basically goes that, the lesson that Democrats need to learn from this election is that, like, it's the economy, right? Like, what this election showed is that people are hurting, and we need to offer, we being, I don't know who we is, but the regime needs to offer, well, the Democratic Party, they say, although,
Well, that's the thing too. It's kind of like they're that's also where we differ a lot, is that we do not want to be like advisors to the Democratic Party. So I think that saying we, it's like it is really ridiculous, but the reason I think we keep saying it, you and I, is because that's the way that some of these sectors are positioning themselves, is like, I mean, this is a whole other can of worms I'm opening, but like the idea that like we as leftists, like we should be making these proclamations and strategic changes so that it's better for Democrats and Democrats will win. But anyway, I digress.
no, but totally, but that's super key, because I think where we can start with this question is that it's evident that, like, as you said at the very beginning, the Democratic Party is doing all of its soul searching. And there's a sector that believes more so in incremental change that will eventually sort of result in power to working people and better conditions for working people, and that will build to that, and see this opportunity, the soul searching of the Democratic Party, as an opportunity to say, turn towards these policies to win your elections, right? And that's basically how the argument goes. If the Democratic Party had offered a program of universal healthcare, universal childcare, of, rent stabilization, if you're in a big city, of free public transportation, then that would have appealed to working class voters, and they wouldn't have lost the working class, and they would have won the election. And basically, the idea goes that the Democratic Party, their pitfall was that they focused way too much on questions of special oppression, and a hollow representation politics. And of course, like, we are, we couldn't be farther from the Democratic Party in some sense, we being Left Voice. But on the one hand, yeah, like, we also don't agree with the way that the Democratic Party puts forward identity politics. But the argument is not that we shouldn't talk about it. And that's what's sort of worrisome about this argument for economic populism, is it's to say, listen, you need everyone you can get. And you're not going to appeal to, white, rural working class voters in Arkansas if you're talking about affirmative action, if you're talking about the rights of people of color and queer people in the United States. Like, we need the lowest common denominator of bread and butter demands. And the problem with this is that those questions of special oppression do exist. And actually, it should be the jobs of socialists who believe that in this intimate connection between exploitation and oppression, and you really can't fight one without the other at the end of the day, right? And that it's capitalism as a whole that has baked into its DNA oppression, racism, sexism, all of it, right? That we can't get rid of the fight for special oppression and the absolute, the essential fight against racism and misogyny and all of this. Like, we can't, raffle those things away to pander to some vision of what the working class as a whole wants. Actually, the fight to unify the ranks of the working class, because this is precisely it. Those things function to divide the working class. And so, what actually is the fight to unite the working class is to unite it around both questions, right? But just not from the hollow representation politics put forward by the Democratic Party. And I'm sorry, but in the next Trump administration, we're going to have to mobilize to defend immigrants. We're going to have to mobilize to defend the rights of women, of trans kids, of queer people in general. Like, we will have to do that. Obviously, I don't think that the argument goes like, don't mobilize for that. And people, in DSA and all of these places are going to be at those protests. But it really matters the national platform, so to speak, if you want to put it in those terms, but more so than that, the strategic platform of a group that purports to fight for socialism. Beyond that, which is sort of gets at more of the question of like the strategic question of the relationship between exploitation and oppression. A comrade said this, and it's so good, that I want to repeat it. Like economic populism, it might win the Democrats the next couple of elections. It might save the Democratic Party, but ultimately, it's just going to buy them time with the working class without actually overturning the conditions that put working class people in the position that they're in today. And only a program that takes up the questions of special oppression from the perspective of fighting against capitalism, of fighting with the united power of the working class, that is not just white people. Like, and that's the whole thing with this election, is that people are like, the working class, the non-white, quote unquote, working class voted for Trump. Well, that's it. Like the working class is multiracial, multi-ethnic, queer, all of it. And to fight for the issues that actually affect people's lives requires taking up the question of special oppression. And so for us, like those two things go hand in hand, and we need a program that unifies the working class.
Yeah, totally. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it and not to be too sort of like literal here, but like, I mean, truly, there is this sort of idea that the working class is, a bunch of white men wearing overalls covered in coal, wielding pickaxes, basically. But I mean, the working class, like you're saying, the working class, is black, it's brown, it's queer. There are trans people who are in the working class, there are immigrants who are in the working class. And so, I mean, if I can put on my sort of like liberal democratic strategist hat for a moment, like it doesn't really make much sense to me that you would alienate huge swaths of your voting base in favor of some sort of mythical definition of like a white working class person. And obviously, yeah, from a socialist perspective, it does not make sense to divide the ranks of the working class rather than to unite them and to fight for all parts of the working class, whether that includes, queer people, black people, immigrants, etc.
Totally. And it gets to the heart of uniting the social movements with the working class, which is essential when we talk about mass action. Whether it's to fight the right, which is arguably how we need to focus our energies, or whether it's fighting for particular reforms for the working class as a whole, it has to involve the people who have been most politicized and who do deeply care about and understand deeply the structural racism, and transphobia, all of these things.
Yeah, I think that that is a really big part of where we see a lot of disagreement with certainly Democrats, but also progressive sectors and some leftist sectors. There is another sort of tendency that I've been seeing in the past 2 weeks, or well, seeing for a while, but especially in the past 2 weeks, which is kind of this idea that people are saying, well, what's important right now is not just sitting and thinking and sitting and strategizing. What's important right now is to organize, join a group, whatever group or whatever organization you think is interesting, whether it's, tenants organizing, whether it's mutual aid, whether it's anti-war protesting, whether it's this, whether it's that. The most important thing is just to organize. Can you talk a little bit about the shortcomings of this strategy?
Yeah, totally. I mean, on the one hand, like I think we have to start from the fact that we're in an incredibly politicized moment, right? And that has been the case not just for the 2024 elections, but it's a longer process. Like, probably, it's one of the expressions of what we were talking about all the way at the top of the episode of organic crisis, right? And the reaction against neoliberalism. Like, there's a whole slice of people who are becoming active in political life and ready to fight, who are seeing we're facing the next 4 years of the Trump administration, and want to organize, right? And yeah, as you said, there's this narrative of just like throwing everything, throwing the spaghetti at the wall, like throwing everything you can, and whatever you do, it's going to help. And on the one hand, like at this point, the left has to come to terms with the fact that strategy is important because our task is enormous. And I think that that is something we can't forget, that of course, like any program worth its weight, like any program that's able to or political perspective that wants to enact change that can overthrow this capitalist system, of course it takes into account the fight for renters' rights. Of course it takes, because that's the situation of the working class in the United States. But the fact is that these questions of strategy actually matter because we want to do it, and of course we need the masses on our side, right? We need, it's the working class is many and the capitalists are few, and the task is to organize the ranks of the working class to be able to take them on. But we argue that that requires organization at every level around a unified fight, and with the understanding that we have a common enemy, is that we have to be clear in the next 4 years who are our enemies and who are our allies. And this has everything to do with the question of class. This has everything to do with our class interests. And the Democrats right now are, and the NGOs to a certain extent who support the Democratic Party, organizations that support the Democratic Party, right now they're panicking and depressed. And in effect, like, I saw in the New York Times a headline that said, the strategy of the Democrats is not to mobilize, get people out of the streets, we're fighting Trump in the courts. Right now they're demobilizing. But if people are angry enough, and that allows space for people to organize in the streets around workplace demands, but not only against racism, against attacks on anti-immigrant attacks, but when that class struggle is more acute, of course the Democratic Party is going to get involved, because that's how they've acted in recent history, right? As the graveyard of social movements, as many people have said before. And so of course they will mobilize to capitalize on that discontent towards the polls and to try to put it towards the ballot box, because, and this gets back to the class interests, like, it's a party, it's a political force that upholds capitalism. And what we're doing when we march in the streets against the genocide, when we march against police brutality and structural racism, and systemic racism, when we march against the closed border policies that, murder and impoverish and make precarious the lives of immigrants, we are fighting against capitalism. And it's important to be clear about that. And I'm not saying, all those atomized fights are automatically fighting against capitalism. But what makes them anti-capitalist is it being able to articulate it as class war, essentially. Not to get all red on the podcast, but it's true, right? And to see that carrying those fights to their ultimate conclusion, that guarantees the material conditions for people to have what they need to survive, requires getting rid of this system, requires having a unified strategy to do so, and a strategy that does not include people who want to uphold the system. And that's super important, right? Is that when we say, there's going to be an immense pressure when the attacks intensify from the Trump administration, there's going to be an intense pressure towards lesser evilism, an intense pressure to unite with the ranks of the Democratic Party against the far right. We have to say, we're not fighting alongside capitalists. And does that mean, of course, that every single person in our coalition is like, yes, socialism, yes, we're only in for revolution? No. But it does mean fighting alongside with a single fist. We will have immense disagreements with the coalition, with the group that is required to push back against the advance of the far right. We're going to have massive disagreements, and we'll have unity on the question of, fighting back against those attacks, but realizing that we can't organize with the people who made those attacks possible. And I think that that's really important to understand, is that this goes beyond trying to vote people into office next time around. And that's going to be the pressure that we face for the next 4 years and beyond. But it does mean having the discussions of strategy, agreeing on the analysis, like to carve the path forward. And to go back to something we talked about earlier in the program, like to be able to unify the ranks of the working class. And that's what's really important, right? Is that the story goes that we use the tools of the bourgeois regime. We use the Democratic Party ballot line because that's where we have power, because the working class is divided. The working class is disempowered. We don't have the structures to do it on our own. And so we have to use what's already there. And, we'll do that. And then we'll also gradually build up power by organizing the working class. We'll gradually build that power until we reach, a critical sum. But the fact is that those leaps happen in class struggle, and class struggle happens outside of that gradual utopian plan, right? And so our job as socialists is to make the most of that. And so there will be class struggle in the years to come. And the best thing that socialists can do is to support that and to bring a clear class independent perspective to say, we support the organization, the self organization, the class independent organization of the working class to fight for its demands and not be co opted by a party that limits those demands and wants to make a peaceful relationship with the bosses and with the state and with the, politicians, the regime. We want the working class to fight as its own actor, as a subject in and of itself.
I think that's a powerful place to end it. Madeleine, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Oden. Happy to be here.